March 8, 2014, 1:19 a.m. A final voice, a routine farewell, and then nothing.
Could be called the mystery of the decade. Where is the Malaysian plane?
Two words that should have ended a shift. Instead, they began the longest search in aviation history. But silence is rarely absolute, because long after the voices vanished, long after radar screens went blank, one signal endured, a whisper, a mathematical trace. What if that last flicker of data wasn't just a meaningless anomaly? What if it was the final message of a missing jetliner? It began, like thousands of other overnight flights. The aircraft, a Boeing 777, one of the most advanced, most reliable jets in commercial service. The route, from Southeast Asia to Beijing, a red-eye flight. At 12:41 a.m. local time, the aircraft lifted into the night sky, its lights winking against the blackness. On board, 239 souls. Business travelers, families, honeymooners. Children already asleep, their heads pressed against the cabin windows. At first, everything was ordinary. By 1:01 a.m., the jet reached its cruising altitude, 35,000 feet. Cabin service began. Seatbelt signs dimmed. The hum of engines settled into white noise. At 1:07 a.m., the plane transmitted its last ACARS report, an automated update on fuel, speed, and systems. Everything looked normal, nothing unusual. At 1:19 a.m., air traffic control contacted the cockpit, preparing to hand the flight off to the next control center. The response was calm, unremarkable. Good night, Malaysian 370. The voice steady, routine. It was the last transmission anyone would hear from the aircraft. 2 minutes later, the transponder, the system that identifies an aircraft to civilian radar, went dark. The plane vanished from controllers' screens. In control rooms, confusion spread quickly. Aircraft do not simply vanish. Controllers tried calling the plane. No response. Other nearby flights were asked to raise it on emergency frequency. Still silence. Within minutes, panic spread through the invisible networks of aviation. But here's the strange part. The aircraft had not crashed. Not yet. Military radar later revealed faint traces. The jet had turned sharply west, back across the Malaysian peninsula. Then it banked again, south, into the vastness of the Indian Ocean. For the next several hours, it flew on, silent, unseen, unreported. By dawn, the jet was overdue. By mid-morning, it was declared missing. News alerts broke around the world. Passenger jet missing. Families await word. Search and rescue underway. In airports, relatives clutched photographs and phones, desperate for updates. In control centers, teams scrambled, checking logs and radar. But as the hours turned into days, something became chillingly clear. This was not a routine search. This was a mystery. Modern aviation was not built for vanishing acts. Satellites, radars, transponders, radios, every flight leaves digital footprints. And yet, this jet had slipped into silence, leaving almost nothing behind. Search planes flew grid after grid, staring down at endless ocean. Warships scanned with sonar. Fishing boats reported floating debris, oil slicks, shadows. Every lead collapsed into false alarms. For families, the torment deepened. How could the world lose a modern jetliner in the 21st century? The answer, at least part of it, was hidden in the whispers of technology. In one final signal. The plane may have fallen silent, but its systems kept whispering. And those whispers, the last signal, may be the closest we have to the truth. In aviation, silence is rarely absolute, even when a radio is switched off, even when a transponder is disabled, even when every voice on board has fallen silent. Some systems keep speaking, some signals keep whispering. And for MH370, it was these whispers that became the only thread investigators could follow. Every modern jet carries a system called ACARS, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System. Think of it as a silent postman. It delivers routine messages between aircraft and ground, engine health, fuel status, position updates. Most passengers never know it exists. On this flight, ACARS sent its last scheduled message at 1:07 a.m. After that, reports stopped. Whether it was disabled or simply stopped transmitting remains debated. But here's the strange part. Even when the reporting system isn't sending content, its underlying network, the satellite link, still exchanges handshakes. Pings. A quiet, "Are you there?" between plane and satellite. For MH370, those handshakes continued. 2:25 a.m., 3:41 a.m., 4:41 a.m., 5:41 a.m., 6:41 a.m., 7:41 a.m., and finally, one last unusual signal at 8:19 a.m. That final handshake is the reason we are still talking about this flight today. These handshakes carried no position, no altitude, no heading. But they did carry something else: time and frequency data. Engineers realized the signals bore tiny distortions caused by the aircraft's movement relative to the satellite, known as the Doppler effect. Imagine standing by a railway. A train approaches, horn blaring. The sound is higher. As it passes and recedes, the pitch drops. The same principle works with radio waves. As MH370 flew toward the satellite, its signals shifted higher. As it moved away, they shifted lower. By analyzing these shifts, engineers plotted a series of arcs, giant rings sweeping across the Indian Ocean. Each handshake fixed the plane's position somewhere along one of those arcs. 7 arcs in total, each farther south. Each a clue, but also a question. To use these arcs, investigators built mathematical models. They accounted for satellite drift, transmission delay, and frequency bias. The results: at 2:25 a.m., the plane was likely near the northern Indian Ocean. By 8:19 a.m., it was far to the south, somewhere in the most remote stretch of water on Earth. But the models weren't perfect. Each arc spanned thousands of miles, a spotlight beam across endless ocean. The truth lay hidden somewhere along those curves. But where? The final signal was different. At 8:19 a.m., the plane suddenly attempted to log back into the satellite network. This wasn't a routine hourly ping. It was a log on request. Why does that matter? Because log-on requests usually occur after a power interruption. When a system shuts down, then comes alive again. To some, this meant fuel exhaustion. Engines flamed out. Power failed. Backup generators kicked in, triggering the last handshake. If that's true, the plane had only minutes left before crashing into the sea. But others read it differently. Perhaps it was an intentional restart. Perhaps someone in the cockpit was still in control. The satellite data was groundbreaking. For the first time, investigators traced a missing aircraft using mathematics alone. But the precision of the arcs was deceptive. Errors stacked up. Atmospheric effects, satellite drift, clock offsets. The uncertainty zone stretched hundreds of miles. Searchers scoured one zone, then another. Each time, the ocean revealed nothing. So, the last signal became both a gift and a curse. The only clue, but not a clear answer. What exactly did that final handshake mean? Was it the death rattle of a powerless aircraft plunging into the abyss? Or was it something more deliberate? The answer depends on how you read a single burst of data. While engineers debated Doppler shifts, families clung to hope. For them, the mystery wasn't math. It was absence. It was love that never came home. For investigators, the case was a puzzle of numbers, signals, and models. But for families, it was something far simpler and far more painful. It was waiting. It was silence. It was the unbearable absence of certainty. When the plane first failed to arrive, the atmosphere was confusion, not panic. Flights are sometimes delayed. Communications can be restored. Families pressed against glass in arrival halls, scanning the doors, waiting for familiar faces. But as minutes stretched into hours, worry spread. Phones rang unanswered. Calls diverted to voicemail. Airline officials repeated a phrase that would become unbearable. "We are still waiting for confirmation." Some relatives clung to hope, believing the plane had landed at a remote airfield, that communications had failed, that survivors would soon walk through the gate. But as the hours turned to dawn, hope thinned. The world had a new phrase now: missing. In waiting lounges, scenes unfolded that words can scarcely capture. Mothers clutched photographs of their children. Husbands showed boarding pass selfies, the last proof their wives had boarded the flight. Children cried, asking questions no one could answer. Officials tried to calm the crowds, but the absence of answers was louder than any explanation. Television cameras arrived. The grief of families became headlines. Faces of missing passengers stared out from screens across the globe. For the relatives, every rumor cut like glass. Debris spotted in the South China Sea. False. An oil slick found. False. A plane landed in a jungle airstrip. False. Each time, the hope surged, then collapsed. Each time, the wound grew deeper. Modern disasters are supposed to come with certainty. GPS trackers, satellite phones, black boxes. But for these families, there was none. Instead, their loved one's fate had been reduced to cryptic terms. Ping, arc, Doppler shift. Imagine being told that the only evidence your child still existed was a mathematical curve drawn across an empty ocean. For one father, the last message from his daughter was a cheerful text: "Boarding now." For another, the final photo was a grainy boarding pass, sent almost casually. Frozen digital echoes of lives that never returned. The torment extended beyond families. Search crews, too, bore the weight of uncertainty. Pilots flew grid after grid, staring down at endless blue, knowing each pass might reveal nothing, or everything. Ships dragged sonar arrays for weeks, their crews battling fatigue, storms, and the crushing knowledge that the ocean might never give up its secret. For many, the hardest part was reporting back empty-handed. Every failure was not just a scientific gap. It was another day of grief for the families waiting ashore. In an information vacuum, speculation spreads like wildfire. Some whispered of hijacking, others of military shootdowns. Still others claimed survivors were alive, held somewhere secret. Every unverified report brought false hope. Every retraction brought heartbreak. For the families, grief was not a single moment. It was a cycle, a cruel rhythm of rumor and disappointment, repeated for weeks, months, years. And so, the human signal of MH370 was not in the data. It was in the waiting. The unanswered phones, the empty arrival halls, the children growing up without parents. For engineers, the plane's legacy was the whisper of a final signal. For families, it was the silence that followed. But while families waited, investigators argued. Because the last signal could be read in different ways. And each interpretation told a radically different story of what happened in the sky. The last signal was not a sentence in words. It was a data burst, a flicker in the static. But even that flicker could be read in different ways. And each reading told a radically different story of what happened in the sky. The most widely accepted interpretation is fuel exhaustion. At 8:19 a.m., the satellite detected a log-on request, a system's attempt to reconnect. This typically happens after a power interruption. Investigators believe this meant the engines had finally flamed out. The main power systems shut down. The backup generator engaged. And in that brief transition, the satellite received its final handshake. After that, the aircraft would have lost thrust. It would have begun to descend, uncontrolled. Within minutes, perhaps seconds, it would have slammed into the ocean at terrifying speed. Evidence supporting this view. Later mathematical models showed descent rates exceeding 15,000 feet per minute. No emergency calls or signals after 1:19 a.m., consistent with crew incapacitation. Debris damage suggested violent impact forces. If true, the ending was sudden, catastrophic, and mercifully quick. But not everyone agrees. Another camp insists the final moments were controlled. They argue someone was still at the controls, guiding the plane into the water deliberately. Why? To minimize debris, to sink the aircraft in one piece. Evidence. The flaperon recovered on Réunion Island was relatively intact, suggesting it had been deployed. A flaperon is typically extended in preparation for a landing, or a water ditching. The limited amount of debris recovered suggests the plane may have entered the water more smoothly, without shattering on impact. If true, this would imply a chilling conclusion, that the disappearance was deliberate, that the pilot, or someone else, chose a remote stretch of ocean to hide the wreck forever. Another possibility, hypoxia, the silent killer of altitude. Imagine a sudden depressurization, oxygen masks deploy, but for some reason, failure, malfunction, the crew becomes incapacitated. So do the passengers. The plane, still on autopilot, continues its journey, unmanned, ghost-like, until fuel exhaustion finally brings it down. Evidence supporting this. The eerie silence after 1:19 a.m. No calls, no transponder codes. The steady flight path for hours, consistent with autopilot. The fact that cabin depressurization incidents have crippled flights before. If true, MH370 became a flying tomb long before it reached the Southern Ocean. Perhaps the most controversial theory, deliberate diversion. The sharp turn west, the systematic disabling of communication systems. The 7-hour flight into one of the most remote places on Earth. To some investigators, this was not mechanical failure. It was intent. Evidence. The transponder did not fail abruptly. It was switched off. The diversion occurred at a precise moment, between air, traffic, control zones. The flight continued for hours, suggesting active decision-making. Motives? Unclear. Speculations ranged from suicide to sabotage to hijacking. None have ever been confirmed, but if true, then the last signal was not a technical artifact. It was the trace of a deliberate act, executed with chilling precision. There were other theories too. Mechanical failure, a catastrophic systems breakdown that disabled communications and left the plane flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. Hijacking, passengers or crew seizing control, steering the plane far off course. Military incident, the suggestion, whispered but never confirmed, that the aircraft strayed into sensitive airspace and was shot down. Each possibility found believers. Each left holes. In the end, the theories divided into two broad camps. 1. Uncontrolled endings, fuel exhaustion, hypoxia, or systems failure, scenarios where the plane spiraled into the ocean. 2. Controlled endings, deliberate ditching or diversion, scenarios where someone guided the plane to its fate. The difference matters. An uncontrolled crash scatters wreckage. A controlled ditching could sink almost whole, leaving almost nothing behind. And so the very nature of the last signal, uncontrolled or deliberate, remains the crux of the debate. Which is worse? A ghost flight, its passengers long gone as the plane flew itself, or a deliberate act carried out with calculation, ending in the most remote stretch of ocean on Earth? The last signal doesn't answer. It only deepens the divide. But while theories multiplied, something tangible finally began to appear. Fragments. Pieces of the missing jet. The ocean was beginning to speak. For more than a year, the ocean said nothing. Search ships combed the waves. Planes flew endless grids. Families waited for word, but the sea remained silent. And then, finally, it began to speak. Not in sentences, but in fragments. In July 2015, more than a year after the disappearance, a beachcomber on Reunion Island stumbled upon something strange in the sand. A large barnacle-crusted piece of composite material. It looked like part of a wing. Investigators confirmed it quickly. It was a flaperon, a hinged surface from the trailing edge of a Boeing 777's wing. For the first time, physical evidence proved what the satellite data had long suggested. The aircraft had gone down in the Indian Ocean. The flaperon carried scars, torn edges, fractured composites. But it also carried something else. Silence. It revealed where the plane had ended, but not how. In the months that followed, more fragments appeared. A horizontal stabilizer in Mozambique, a wing flap in Tanzania, cabin interior panels scattered along Madagascar's coast. Each fragment traveled thousands of miles on ocean currents before washing ashore. Each was studied, cataloged, compared. Some showed signs of violent impact, edges sheared by immense force. Others seemed surprisingly intact. Together, the debris confirmed the tragedy, but it also deepened the mystery, because the pattern didn't fit neatly into any single theory. Scientists turned to unlikely witnesses: barnacles. The flaperon recovered on Réunion was encrusted with them. Marine biologists realized they could use the growth of these organisms as a natural clock. By studying barnacle size, age, and chemical composition, researchers hoped to trace where the debris had floated. Barnacles absorb isotopes from the surrounding water, chemical fingerprints unique to different parts of the ocean. Analysis suggested the flaperon had drifted for months before reaching land. But tracing back its journey proved difficult. Currents meander, winds shift, the trail blurred. Still, the barnacles confirmed one thing: the wreck had lain far out in the Indian Ocean. Exactly where, though, remained elusive. Oceanographers joined the hunt, building computer simulations of the Indian Ocean's chaotic currents. They dropped virtual debris into models, letting it drift across weeks, months, years. The simulations suggested a likely crash zone along a remote corridor west of Australia. Search vessels redirected there. Sonar systems swept mile after mile of seabed. Robotic subs plunged into canyons nearly 3 miles deep. They found shipwrecks. They found geological formations never before mapped. But they did not find MH370. Each failure weighed heavily. For search crews, it was exhaustion. For families, it was agony. Every piece of debris confirmed the loss. But none revealed the cause. The flaperon showed no sign of fire, no residue of explosives, no clues to what had unfolded in the cockpit. It was evidence of tragedy, without explanation. The sea had kept the jet hidden, but it could not hide the truth forever. In fragments and barnacles, in drifts and scars, the ocean whispered, The plane had fallen here. The plane had ended here. But it would not say why. So investigators returned to the data, to the last signal, reanalyzing it with sharper tools. And what they found shifted the mystery again. The ocean gave fragments, but the data, the digital traces, still held the greatest promise. So investigators returned to the signals, to the handshakes, to the final log-on at 8:19 a.m. And with new tools, sharper models, and years of hindsight, they began to see patterns they had missed before. The final signal was not routine. It was a log-on request, the system trying to reconnect with the satellite network. Why does this matter? Because log-on requests occur after interruptions. A power cycle, a system shut down, then back up. Investigators initially concluded this was caused by fuel exhaustion. Engines flamed out. Power died. The backup generator re-engaged. But later analysis showed subtle details. The signal wasn't just a simple restart. It carried timing irregularities, hints of stress in the systems. It was not the smooth, predictable handshake of a healthy aircraft. It was more like the gasp of a failing machine. Researchers re-examined the Doppler shifts of the final minutes. The results were staggering. Models suggested the plane was descending at up to 15,000 feet per minute. Some simulations even showed rates as high as 25,000 feet per minute. For comparison, a controlled descent is 1,500 to 2,000 feet per minute. Commercial jets rarely exceed 5,000. This meant one thing. The aircraft was in a steep, likely uncontrolled dive. If true, the end was fast, catastrophic. The plane may have shattered on impact, scattering debris that quickly sank. This view supported the fuel exhaustion theory, that no one was flying the plane when it went down. But evidence from the debris told another story. The flaperon recovered on Réunion showed signs it may have been deployed. Flaperons are not used during cruise. They extend during landing or in preparation for a ditching. If it was indeed deployed, then someone was controlling the aircraft to the very end, which contradicted the idea of an uncontrolled spiral dive. So which was it? A high-speed crash or a controlled water landing? The last signal pointed one way. The flaperon pointed another. Another angle came from the ocean itself. Researchers tracked the paths of floating debris using drift models. By releasing buoys and tracking currents, they narrowed possible crash zones. One study placed the likely impact site in a corridor west of Australia, within a 200-mile strip. Others suggested the southern Indian Ocean, far from any shipping lanes or islands. The debris told them where. The last signal told them when, but neither revealed how. Some analysts suggested something unsettling, that the final signal itself may have been corrupted, that electrical failures or system errors distorted its meaning. If true, the last handshake may have been less of a clue and more of a mirage, a ghost in the data. But even a ghost can shape a search. For years, billions of dollars in operations were guided by those arcs, those Doppler shifts, that final flicker. If the data was misleading, then the greatest search in aviation history may have been chasing shadows. By the late 2000s, investigators faced a split reality. The descent model suggested an uncontrolled plunge. The debris suggested possible control at the end. The drift analysis narrowed locations, but not causes. The log-on request hinted at fuel exhaustion, but left room for intent. Each piece of evidence pulled in different directions. Together, they formed a puzzle that resisted final assembly. The last signal remained the key piece. But like any key, it could unlock multiple doors. The redecoding of the last signal brought investigators closer, but it also revealed something darker. that even in the final minutes, systems were alive, still trying to connect, still whispering into the void. The plane was speaking, not in words, but in code. And that code was still not fully understood. But the mystery of MH370 was never just technical. It was also political, because not all the data was shared, and not all the silence came from the ocean. The mystery of MH370 was never only about oceans and signals. It was also about shadows, about secrets, about what was said and what was withheld. Because in the fog of uncertainty, another question arose. Was the whole truth ever revealed? In the first chaotic hours, military radars in several nations tracked an unidentified aircraft. The blip appeared. It turned west. It crossed peninsulas, then vanished into open water. Later, those traces were confirmed as MH370. But here's the problem. Why wasn't that information released immediately? For days, the search focused on the wrong ocean, the South China Sea, while the true path of the aircraft led west and south. Precious time wasted. Families misled. Officials later said it was because radar data was considered sensitive, a matter of national security. Releasing it would have revealed capabilities, weaknesses, and blind spots. But to grieving families, it felt like something else. Secrecy. When the first investigation reports were released, many pages were heavily redacted. Whole sections blacked out. Technical logs, crew histories. Even the details of cargo on board were at first withheld. The justification was procedure. But to outsiders, it looked like concealment. And in the absence of certainty, speculation rushed in to fill the void. Was something dangerous in the hold? Were there political factors influencing the search? Or was it simply bureaucratic caution, magnified by tragedy? Some claimed powerful nations knew more than they admitted. That radar data, satellite intelligence, even military observations were held back. Others pointed to suspicious timing. Key information seemed to appear only after international pressure. Each release raised more questions than answers. The result? A fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Some said the plane was diverted intentionally and hidden. Others whispered of interception gone wrong, military jets mistaking it for a threat. Still others claimed the jet had landed somewhere remote, its passengers silenced. None of these theories were ever proven, but secrecy, intentional or not, gave them life. The search for MH370 became the most expensive in aviation history. Over $200 million spent. Millions of square kilometers scanned. At first, a coalition of nations worked together. Australia, China, Malaysia, and others. But as months dragged into years, political will fractured. Questions of cost, questions of responsibility, questions of blame. Each nation had its own priorities. Each had its own sensitivities. And in that tangle, families often felt abandoned. The ocean had hidden the wreck. Politics hid the rest. For families, secrecy felt like betrayal. It wasn't just that they had lost loved ones. It was that they were told to trust systems, airlines, governments, technologies that seemed incapable of honesty or unwilling to share. In one press conference, relatives stormed the stage, demanding answers. In another, they held up photos of the missing, pleading for truth. Each official statement was met with suspicion, because when answers are delayed, when data is withheld, trust collapses. And in its place, grief turns to anger. And so another layer was added to the mystery. Not just what happened in the cockpit, but what happened in the aftermath. Were mistakes made in good faith, or was there something more deliberate? No investigation ever proved suppression, but the very possibility that someone, somewhere, chose silence over truth became part of the legacy. By now, the stakes had grown larger than one flight. This was not just about 239 people. It was about whether the systems we trust, the radars, the satellites, the authorities, are truly capable of keeping us safe. Because if a plane can vanish, if data can be withheld, if oceans and governments alike can hide the truth, what does that say about our world? The last signal was already haunting, but the shadows surrounding it made the silence even darker. The last signal of MH370 may be the closest thing to a final message. But even decoded, it is not closure. It is a reminder of how fragile our certainties really are. The last signal of MH370 may be the closest thing we have to a final message. But even decoded, it is not closure. It is mathematics without a body, coordinates without a grave. It is a whisper in code, a signal that points not to certainty, but to the limits of what we know. If the models are right, the wreck still lies at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, perhaps in pieces, perhaps in larger, intact sections, 3 miles down. In darkness, in silence, in pressure so crushing that steel buckles like paper. If the models are wrong, then the wreck may be somewhere else entirely, still hidden, still waiting. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and until the wreck is found, the last signal remains only a map without a destination. In the 21st century, we live in an age of constant surveillance. Phones track our movements. Satellites see every shadow on Earth. Every moment is recorded, time-stamped, logged. And yet, an entire airliner vanished. This was not a relic from a forgotten era. It was a modern jet, filled with the latest avionics, flying across one of the busiest regions of the world. Its disappearance revealed a paradox, that the global aviation system was built for routine, not for anomaly. It could track thousands of flights, but it could not explain the silence of one. In the aftermath, reforms were promised. New mandates required planes to broadcast their positions more frequently. Satellites were upgraded to track emergency signals continuously, and yet, questions remain. If such a disappearance could happen once, could it happen again? For families, reform was little comfort. They had been asked to place faith in systems, airlines, governments, technologies, systems that failed them. Their grief became a legacy of absence. Children grew up without parents. Parents grew old without closure. For some, the last signal was a cruel reminder. Their loved one's existence reduced to a line of code. For others, it was a fragile thread of hope, that one day the wreck would be found, and the silence finally broken. But as years passed, grief hardened into memory, and memory hardened into history. The disappearance did not just haunt families. It shook the world's confidence in aviation. If radar, satellites, and global tracking could fail, what else could slip through the cracks? If governments could withhold data in the name of security, what other truths could be buried? If the ocean could swallow a modern jet, what else might it be hiding? These were not just technical questions. They were ethical ones. Because MH370 revealed not just the fragility of machines, but the fragility of trust. The Indian Ocean is the least understood of Earth's great waters. Its depths are mapped more poorly than the surface of Mars. It holds ridges taller than mountains, canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, currents that twist and churn like invisible rivers. And somewhere within that labyrinth lies the wreck of MH370. Its fuselage, its black boxes, its unspoken answers. Until it is found, the ocean is both grave and witness. It knows the truth. It simply has not revealed it. So we are left with questions. What exactly did the last signal mean? A death spiral or a controlled descent? Why did the plane turn? Why were systems shut down in stages? Why was radar data withheld? Who, if anyone, guided the flight into the most remote corridor of the planet? And why? Each question branches into more. Each answer remains unfinished. The last signal is not closure. It is a doorway. In an age of satellites, algorithms, and real-time tracking, we like to believe nothing can simply vanish. But MH370 reminds us, it can. The final handshake showed us a system still alive, still reaching for connection. But it also showed us the limits of connection. If it happened once, what's to stop it from happening again?